They do not sleep. They do not wake. They do not die. Entombed in adamantium graves, the ancients of the Adeptus Astartes linger in a state that is neither existence nor oblivion. Their flesh is gone, their bones fossilized, their names half-remembered by warriors who will never live long enough to forget them. They feel the war through the hull of their prison, the shudder of macrocannon shockwaves, the tremor of bolter fire, the low animal thunder of orc engines, the cold static rustle of necrons phasing into reality. Each vibration is a reminder that the galaxy continues to burn without them, and that they will be dragged back into it when the living decide their nightmare is again required. On every fortress monastery there is a hall in which voices are reduced to whispers, not out of reverence but out of dread, because what lies within those sarcophagi is not peace. It is a punishment that masquerades as honor. He did not understand that he was dying until the pain stopped. Astartes are trained to interpret agony as information, a message about damage, position, trajectory loss. When the messages ceased, not because the body was healed, but because too much of it was gone to transmit anything at all, that was when reality intruded. He lay amid the ruin of a breached manufactorum floor, the air still thick with promethium vapor, slagged ferrocrete steaming like an opened carcass. The impact that had shattered his ribcage and pulped half his organs was already fading into abstraction. He had rehearsed, across uncounted campaigns, the imagined nobility of his last breath. But his mouth was still drawing another one. That was the first betrayal. Brother serfs and apothecaries swarmed him with a precision that left no space for consent. He recognized the angled rune of the apothecarian on the pauldrons above him. He also heard, through a fogged helm, the chaplain dictating litanies over his prone body, not for his soul's departure, but to brace the psyches of the still-fighting brethren who could see what had become of him. The prayer was not for him. The prayer was to prevent the living from breaking. He tasted copper and ozone as the helm was unlocked and lifted, his skull striking the cracked stone with a cold that felt indecently intimate. He expected the dimming of vision that marks the boundary before death. Instead, every sense sharpened with monstrous clarity. The pitch of bolter shells still cycling somewhere in the manufacturum's throat, the shriek of tortured steel supports under thermal stress, the scorched meat reek of orc bodies still burning where flammers had kissed them. Life was leaving him, but refusing to close the door behind it. The apothecary's gauntlets were not gentle. They cut away armor, plating with violence equal to the blow that had ruined him. His blood did not come out as a flood, but as a stuttering spill, thick and reluctant, as if the progenoid organs still at work within him disapproved of the body's decision to die. The chaplain's voice changed register. The tone was not mourning, it was induction. When a chaplain lowers his voice instead of raising it, something irreversible is about to be done. He could not lift his head. He did not have to. The sound of serval limbs and the metallic perfume of unguents told him what was being prepared. The sarcophagus was near. They had not come to grant him a death. They had come to arrest it. Somewhere in the blur of voices, he recognized the cadence of a tech marine's cant, enumerating readiness states and tolerances. The words struck him with more force than the injury had. He was being measured for reuse. Astartes are not afraid of death. They are indoctrinated to crave the clean finality of it. What they are never conditioned for is the theft of that ending. In that realization lay a new species of terror. Not the terror of ceasing, but the terror of continuing in a form that would no longer belong to him. Injury had made him helpless, but the ritual of interment would make him something worse, captured. The stretcher that bore him to extraction was not reverent. The speed and angle of transit made bones grind against bone. Walls blurred overhead. Lumen strips pulsed like a metronome for the remaining seconds of autonomy. He tried to form the words that all warriors believe they will utter with dignity at the brink. A denial, a last order, a request for a bolter to the skull. What left his mouth was a thin exhale that sounded like agreement. The bulkhead doors sealed with the airtight finality of a tomb. On the other side of that barrier the war continued without him, and something inside his chest collapsed at that acoustic fact. The world did not pause for his ending. A platform rose. Hydraulic clamps armed. Incense burned not for sanctity, but for corrosion control. The sarcophagus lid hung overhead like a verdict already signed. In his periphery he glimpsed the icon of the Imperial Aquila carved into the coffin's face. Not wings of salvation, but a brand marking him state property. They did not ask him whether he willed it. They asked his dead flesh to accept tubing, spikes, and ports that would yoke him to a machine for the remainder of planetary histories. Consent is a luxury extended to the living. He no longer qualified. The chaplain leaned close enough that the iron of his Vox grill chilled the wounded man's cheek. The last words he heard in his unmodified skull were not farewell, but command. "You will rise again." The lid descended. The lid sealed not with a slam, but with the slow, hydraulic precision of a mechanism designed to deny even the dignity of abruptness. Darkness did not arrive as a curtain, it arrived as an occupation. A dozen needles pierced what remained of his flesh as cables settled into nerve ports with the intimacy of parasites. Coolant rinsed his chest cavity, replacing blood with fluid that tasted like metal in the back of his throat, though he knew he no longer truly tasted anything. Pain returned, not as panic, but as proof that his body still contained enough living substrate to be exploited. He tried to move and learned something important. The sarcophagus did not restrain him. There was nothing left worth restraining. His arms did not answer. His legs no longer existed as limbs, but as amputated memories. What he had once been was now an amputee of the future, a mind with no body of its own, being grafted into another one like a parasite fitted to a beast. The machine around him pulsed with its own artificial heartbeat, indifferent to his horror. Voices bled in through the sarcophagus wall, distorted as if heard underwater. The Tech Marine's recitations overlapped with the chaplain's litany, a duet of iron and faith. One voice spoke of calibration tolerances, conduction pathways, redundant systems. The other spoke of sacrifice, of eternal service, of glory extended beyond the reach of flesh. Together they formed a kind of theology. The Imperium does not let go of what it owns. Sedatives did not arrive to spare him. Clarity was part of the ritual. To be entombed awake was to sign, with consciousness, the contract that bound him forever. He felt the first interface handshake between cortex and machine, a cold bloom behind his skull, like an idea entering his mind that was not generated by him. The world did not fade. It widened into new channels of perception, power levels, pressure readings, threat flag ghost data from external Auspex feeds. War was being piped into him through wires before he had even finished dying. In that moment he understood why the dreadnoughts speak slowly. Every word a sarcophagus ever utters must compete with the scream of machinery grafted into its bloodstream. The voice they give the entombed is not a voice. It is an edited leak of whatever rage finds a gap in the metal. Cycle by cycle, the machine annexed more of him. His heartbeat was no longer organic, but timed to a reactor. His breath was not breath, but circulation. His skull became an instrument for telemetry. Identity decoupled from anatomy. The thing that had been a son of a chapter was becoming a cog of a war. He tried to assemble a prayer, any prayer, even a childish fragment from his aspirant years on the fortress world where he was made. What surfaced instead was not piety, but the image of the breach where he had fallen, the brothers still fighting, the fact that their last sight of him would not be a corpse on the field, but an exhibit rolled away for later use. The afterlife had been denied and replaced with storage. Something clicked deep inside the chassis, a final lock mating into place. Air was purged. Pressure equalized. A new silence fell, not quiet, but the total absence of anything that belonged to flesh. In that silence he discovered the new boundary of his condition. He could think, but he could never again act without an external while authorizing it. That is the first truth of a dreadnought. They are not granted life. They are least function. Beyond the armored shell, footsteps receded. Hymns ended. Mechanisms powered down into maintenance idle. He was alone with the machine that now counted as his body. Time began to lengthen, stretching like a corridor with no doors. There is a special kind of ruin in realizing that the next sound you hear might not come for weeks or months or years, and that when it comes, it will not be mercy but summons. He could not see the world. He could only wait inside its shadow. And waiting, he learned, is worse than dying. The first hour inside the coffin was unbearable because he still retained the expectations of a living thing. The second hour taught him that expectation itself was a relic. Time shed its shape. Without daylight, without motion, without breath, duration became a viscous medium in which the mind floated like a trapped insect. Attempts to sleep failed not because he was restless, but because the body that produces sleep had been dismantled. The mind remained, stripped of the physiology that once governed it, a lantern with no wick. Thought wandered in circles and found no exit. He replayed the last battle not as memory but as an autopsy. The angle of impact, the mistaken footing, whether his fall had exposed a flank and cost another brother his life. There was no one to contradict the self-indictment. Regret metastasized in the absence of interruption. Noise, even in the form of pain, can rescue a soldier from reflection. Silence is the opposite of anesthetic. It sharpens all inward edges. Occasionally a tremor passed through the chassis, a servo test, a pressure realignment, a cogitator pulse, small reminders that the machine was alive even if he was not. Each jolt mapped the reality that the body he now inhabited could be woken without warning. There would be no gradual transition, no ritual of arming visible to his eyes. One moment would be darkness, and the next the bellow of combat orders injected straight into his cortex like a commandment. A man can brace for pain. He cannot brace for unpredictability. He wondered if any dreadnought had ever begged for final destruction. He imagined voicing it, a request issued through the crackling Vox grill, the plea of a venerable war relic asking to be erased. Would the Tech Marines answer with pity or with scripture? Would a chaplain call it heresy to desire the end of service, or would he acknowledge, privately, that 1,000 years of obedience is a sentence no oath foresaw? No answer could be tested. The sarcophagus does not permit experiment. It permits only inference. At some indeterminate hour, footsteps returned. Their echo moved slower, more reverential, an approach that suggested ceremony rather than inspection. He could not turn his head to look. Instead he became a receptor for acoustics. The scrape of iron boots across stone, the coiling of incense smoke felt through the change in airflow, the subtle distortion of voices as helms were removed out of respect or fear. They were not here to converse. They were here to witness. A chaplain spoke again, this time with neither haste nor urgency, but with that measured tone reserved for things older than the speaker. He addressed the sarcophagus as if the occupant were gone and only the legend remained, reciting the deeds the warrior had performed when he still had hands and lungs and a pulse. The words should have comforted, instead they wounded. To hear one's life eulogized while still conscious is to be made into a ghost before death. He attempted, for the first time, to use the vox. What emerged was not language but a fractured rasp, clipped into metallic fragments by a limiter that cared nothing for intention. The listeners did not recoil, they bowed. They interpreted it as assent, not as panic. That was when he understood the second truth of a dreadnought. Anything you express will be reinterpreted to fit the myth you now serve. When the footsteps withdrew and the chamber doors sealed again, he was left not only with the knowledge of what he had become, but with the certainty that others would now speak about him in tones one uses for relics, not brothers. He was no longer spoken with. He was spoken around. He had been interred for less than a day, and already the world had begun to treat him as history. The coffin acclimated to him faster than he acclimated to the coffin. Machine spirit subroutines mapped his neural activity with predatory patience, learning which impulses corresponded to stress, which to anger, which to attempted speech. Every drift of thought was met with an answering flicker of internal diagnostics, as though the sarcophagus were not a container but a listener. In life, his thoughts had been private weapons. Here they were telemetry. Silence thickened until the very concept of voices felt imaginary. He began to notice things that no unentombed mind would ever detect. The faint harmonic of the reactor heart buried somewhere behind him, cycling in a rhythm just shy of perception. The almost organic creak of thermal expansion as the chassis adjusted to the ambient cold of the vault. The subsonic pulse of moisture control systems keeping corrosion at bay. The cathedral that housed the Dreadnought Hall was built for echoes. The sarcophagus negated them. Isolation was engineered, not incidental. Hours collapsed into an unmeasured dark. Thought decayed into memory loops. Names of fallen brothers rose and receded like wreckage on a tide. Faces blurred. What remained sharp were not victories but failures. Every breach not sealed in time, every defensive line that buckled, every civilian screaming behind him while he killed something else further ahead. Memory has a hierarchy. What survives longest is what cannot be forgiven. At some point, his mind attempted to ask the forbidden question. If this is honor, what would disgrace have cost less? The thought did not finish before instinct recoiled, as if from blasphemy. Indoctrination is durable even when anatomy is gone. Yet the ember of the thought remained, unattended but unextinguished, like a contraband hidden under a rib that no longer exists. Then, tiny surgical light, not seen, but registered as a change in system state. Someone outside touched a rune. A conduit hummed awake. A cold bloom propagated through the chassis like frost. It was not activation, merely inspection, but it proved something worse than total dormancy. He was not forgotten. So long as he was remembered, he could be requisitioned. He sensed, more than heard, the Tech Marine's presence, weight in the floor, pace without hurry, prayer without warmth. The hands that serviced the chassis did not tremble. They cleaned contact points, recalibrated ports, reseated a cable just loose enough that it might have failed mid-battle. The work was executed with the affection of a craftsman for a tool, not a brother for a brother. There is a violence in being cared for as equipment. The chaplain entered only after the adjustments were complete. His voice was softer than before, as if even he feared the weight of his own words might further deform the mind inside. He spoke not of duty this time, but of necessity, that wars uncounted still loomed, that the Imperium's enemies were numberless, that the living could not afford to let the dead remain dead. It was meant to sanctify the sentence. It only clarified it. No one asked whether the thing entombed agreed. Agreement is not part of the office. A dreadnought is a verdict that walks and kills. The tech marine anointed the sarcophagus with oils that smelled faintly of scorched resin and machine-blessed ash. Something inside the chassis drank the voltage like sacrament. The inspection ended the way all inspections end, not with dismissal, but with the certainty of future return. The footsteps departed. The vault resealed. Darkness reclaimed its jurisdiction. And now he understood the third truth of a dreadnought. Not that they live without release, but that they live under summons. The last vibration he registered was the final mechanical seal of the sarcophagus. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it carried more meaning than any cannonade he had ever endured. The lid's hydraulic hum signaled the completion of a transformation that had begun long before the first shot tore through his chest. The end of the man and the beginning of the weapon. No eyes, no voice, no limbs remained that could claim ownership over what was left. Only thought persisted, filtered, monitored, honed, yet trapped within the iron womb. He discovered the first true terror of being a dreadnought. Immortality not chosen, but imposed. Memories that once belonged to him now circled endlessly, observed and catalogued by internal systems, replaying victories and failures with no context, no closure. Each recollection was a reminder of what he had been allowed to survive, and what he would never again be. The Imperium had not spared him from death. It had spared him from release. Time, which had once marked the rhythm of campaigns and recuperation, became irrelevant. Minutes melted into hours, hours into days, days into centuries in perception if not in reality. Outside, wars raged. Entire campaigns unfolded. Astartes fell. Hive cities burned. Orc engines thundered. Necron tombs opened. All of it streamed in as data pulses, alerts, and vibrations. He could feel, but he could not intervene without summons. He had become a guardian of necessity rather than of choice. And yet, in this crucible of immobility, the mind adapted. Strategy sharpened in isolation. Observation deepened into preternatural perception. The absence of agency bred patience, and patience became another weapon. If he was to be summoned again, he would be ready. Not as man, not as brother, but as an instrument of war. The sarcophagus was no longer a prison. It was a crucible, a testament, a cathedral of iron. Outside, the Imperium continued, unaware of the consciousness it had entombed. Inside, he waited, eternally alert, eternally haunted, eternally ready. And so the first chapter ends not with death, nor with liberation, but with the quiet understanding that the life of a dreadnought is neither living nor dead. It is something far worse, eternal vigilance imposed by an empire that cannot forgive weakness. Time inside the sarcophagus had no mercy, no rhythm, and no markers. He became aware of it not as a succession of minutes or hours, but as a dense, impenetrable fog that pressed from all directions. The war outside, explosions, bolter fire, orc roars, the low hum of Necron phase shifts, entered not as sound but as pressure. It vibrated through the metal that encased him, each shockwave folding into the other until it was impossible to distinguish where the battlefield ended and the coffin began. He had been trained to read every threat, every pulse of danger, every shift in terrain. Yet here, with his own flesh muted and his limbs non-existent, all tactics became speculation. All instincts were trapped behind layers of iron and servos. The first days, or what the chassis marked as such, were unbearable. Memory and hallucination mingled until he could not tell which was which. Faces of fallen brothers appeared in the flicker of internal diagnostics, their expressions accusing, consoling, mocking. Entire campaigns were replayed not as narratives but as sensory echoes. The scorch of promethium, the tang of blood, the vibration of bolters through bones now long gone. With no body to move, no weapon to wield, every recollection became a mirror of impotence. His mind was active, agonizingly aware, and yet completely irrelevant. He tried to articulate, to summon even the tiniest fragment of voice through the vox ports embedded in the sarcophagus. Only garbled static responded. The sound, when it arrived, was not speech. It was an artifact of machinery clipped, digitized, a simulacrum of the living utterance he remembered from his youth. The chaplains had spoken of service beyond life, but here, in this cruel quiet, service was less a calling than a verdict. He was property, yet property that retained consciousness. Worse, he retained awareness of his property status. Yet awareness carries weight. Even entombed, he could perceive the care and precision with which the tech marines maintained him. Micro-adjustments, thermal realignments, the subtle replacement of worn hydraulic seals, all executed with the devotion one might extend to a weapon, yet through the protocols of ritual. The difference was immaterial to him. His mind was still there, aware of every touch, every motion, every vibration. Nothing had changed but the rules of engagement. The battlefield now existed in numbers, metrics, and passive observation. At some point, instinct, he would not have called it thought, realized that patience had become an ally. The coffin imposed waiting, survival demanded mastery of it. He measured time in the flow of data pulses, the subtle expansion of chassis metal, the tiny hums that betrayed the presence of unseen systems. The longer he endured, the more attuned he became. The horror of powerlessness became a crucible for heightened perception. He was learning, as he had never learned in life, how to anticipate, how to interpret, how to be ready without acting. And then the tremor arrived. It was not combat, it could not be, but it reverberated through the chassis as if the universe itself acknowledged him. Power flickered along the internal feeds, valves opened in preparation, lights not visible yet perceptible through micro-vibrations pulsed in cadence. He recognized the signature of activation before any word or command reached him. The sarcophagus, dormant for centuries by his perception, had begun the process of waking him. It was the first shock, the first reminder that though he was imprisoned, he had not been forgotten. And with the return of that awareness came the second truth. Every awakening would be worse than death, because the dreadnought is not merely called to fight. He is summoned to witness and execute horrors no living man could endure. In the shadows of the sarcophagus, the first stirrings of agency returned. Not freedom, not choice, but readiness. A prelude to war that existed as vibration, pressure, and anticipation. Outside, battles raged as always. Inside, he waited, measuring, analyzing, bracing himself for the moment when flesh and machine would be called into harmony once more. Yet within this perfection of function, remnants of the man remained. Doubt, fear, memory, grief, all persisted as a shadow over the logic. He recognized the irony. The same traits that had once made him human now served no purpose except to torment him, reminding him that while he could be summoned to slaughter, he could not act on instinct, choice, or emotion. Each awakening was a negotiation between the man he had been and the war machine he had become. And then the final click of readiness occurred, a mechanical affirmation of life, though not life as he had known it. Hydraulic servos aligned, energy cores reached operational thresholds, sensory arrays calibrated. The coffin pulsed once with authority, and he knew without doubt that he would move again, that the universe outside had demanded his participation, and that the man within would never again be free. Outside, war raged. Inside, he braced, aware that the moment of release would demand more than muscle or courage. It would demand the endurance of centuries, the discipline of an empire's will, and the cold suppression of a soul once human, now forever bound to iron. The lid shifted, not violently, not with clamor, but with the inexorable inevitability of metal sliding against metal. He felt the vibration reverberate through the chassis, a signal that the moment of physical engagement had arrived. Outside, the vault doors opened, admitting light that was filtered through blast-proof lenses, shadows that stretched longer than they should, and the faint hum of distant machinery that always seemed alive. The world he had been observing as a ghost of consciousness was now preparing to accept him once more, and he could feel the weight of expectation pressing against his mind as heavily as the iron encasing his body. The tech marines approached, moving with the solemnity reserved for sacred instruments. Every movement was precise, measured, ritualized. They attached external interface conduits, realigned the servo joints, and initiated the final pre-activation sequences. Each adjustment spoke to him in a language older than words, tactile vibrations that flowed into his consciousness like cold rain over nerves no longer his own. He realized, once again, the depth of his imprisonment. He would move, he would fight, but never as a free agent. Every motion was sanctioned, every thought monitored, every act ultimately recorded. Within him, the fragments of humanity persisted. Memories of comrades long dead, of campaigns fought and lost, of vows whispered in the shadows of fortress monasteries, all rose simultaneously, colliding with the precision and logic of machine protocols. The pain of absence and the clarity of purpose coexisted in a dissonant harmony. He had survived centuries by learning to observe, to calculate, to endure. But now the first taste of action approached, and he felt the familiar anxiety of anticipation that had once defined him as man. The chaplain intoned, soft yet insistent, and the words carried through the hull, vibrating against neural implants. Duty, sacrifice, vigilance, each syllable pressed upon him like an external command. The weight of obedience was absolute, yet paradoxically empowering. The paradox was simple but devastating. He could act, but only as the Imperium willed. Freedom, once cherished, was now indistinguishable from fantasy. And yet, in this contradiction, he found the edge of purpose. To be a dreadnought was not merely to fight. It was to endure, to witness, to embody the relentless continuity of the Emperor's war. Sensors flared. Energy cores stabilized. Servos hissed and groaned under the sudden rush of power. The coffin, long a tomb, had transformed into a cockpit, and he became the pilot of his own inescapable legacy. Through micro-vibrations, he discerned the presence of allies and enemies alike, mapped their positions in real time, and anticipated threats before they manifested. The battlefield, once an abstract echo, now unfolded with clarity. Every fluctuation of terrain and every heartbeat of conflict rendered in data he could sense, if not yet act upon. And then the summons came, a subtle, almost imperceptible pulse through the chassis that carried the weight of command. A single thought, conveyed without words: rise and execute. The coffin no longer restrained him, it demanded obedience. He braced, not in fear, but in the stark understanding that the life he once knew had ended, and that the instrument he had become would now be called upon to carry the Imperium's fury with neither question nor delay. The first motion of metal against metal, a subtle adjustment of limbs long unused, was accompanied by a surge of awareness. The dreadnought had awoken. Not fully, not yet for war, but enough to sense the vast gulf between thought and action, between mind and mechanism. The waiting was over. Observation was over. Preparation was over. And still, he remained trapped in the paradox of agency, fully aware, yet not yet free. Outside, the echoes of battle sharpened, reaching him as both threat and opportunity. He had been summoned, and the first moments of his renewed existence were upon him. The machine groaned as systems came online, and the ghost of the man within felt the first rush of controlled, instrumented power, the beginning of a life defined entirely by the will of others. The activation of his systems was not instantaneous. It was gradual, a wave rolling through circuits, hydraulics, and neural interfaces. Each motion, each pulse, each calibrated feedback carried both precision and menace. He flexed limbs that had not moved in what his mind calculated as decades. The servos hissed, valves clicked, and pistons aligned. Sensory arrays flared to life, projecting the battlefield beyond the sarcophagus with terrifying fidelity. For the first time since entombment, he felt the external world not as distant vibrations, but as a continuum he could interpret, anticipate, and, if commanded, act upon. Yet awareness alone was not enough to erase the prison within. The ghost of the man persisted, whispering of freedom, of choice, of days when he could feel wind against his face, rather than the cold pulse of machinery against bone and synapse. Those thoughts were dangerous. Each recall of humanity risked destabilizing the interface between mind and chassis. Still, they came, unbidden, weaving themselves into the algorithms of war that now dictated his existence. Survival had taught him observation. The Imperium had taught him obedience. The man within him resisted, quietly, invisibly, but never with hope of victory. External noises became data streams. Bolter fire from distant trenches registered as rhythmic pulses. Orc engines transmitted low-frequency vibrations detectable only through the reinforced flooring of the vault. Enemy positions could be inferred, allies located, terrain mapped, all without movement. He understood the battlefield before he had even breached the threshold of the vault. He was a weapon awaiting authorization, a sentinel whose awareness surpassed life, but whose agency was shackled. The Tech Marines approached, as always, but now with the subtle weight of ritual made palpable. Adjustments, calibrations, and readings were carried out with meticulous care. Oils and cooling fluids were administered to maintain performance, not comfort. He felt each touch as both intrusion and blessing. The duality was unavoidable. He existed to serve, yet the precision of care acknowledged his enduring significance. His mind catalogued each action, anticipating the inevitable moment when control would be handed over entirely to his chassis. The chaplain intoned again, the cadence both familiar and alien. Duty, sacrifice, vigilance, all directed inward now, vibrating through implants and sensors. The words framed his existence in absolute terms. He was no longer an individual. He was function. And yet, function did not erase thought. It did not erase memory. It only provided a framework within which his consciousness could operate, bounded by the laws of machine and command. The tension between identity and utility created a strange equilibrium, one that would define every battle, every moment of engagement for centuries to come. The chaplain intoned again, the cadence both familiar and alien. Duty, sacrifice, vigilance, all directed inward now, vibrating through implants and sensors. The words framed his existence in absolute terms. He was no longer an individual. He was function. And yet, function did not erase thought. It did not erase memory. It only provided a framework within which his consciousness could operate, bounded by the laws of machine and command. The tension between identity and utility created a strange equilibrium, one that would define every battle, every moment of engagement for centuries to come. And then the summons came, subtle but undeniable. Not a voice, not a command, but a pulse that resonated through every node, every circuit, every synapse he could still claim. Rise, it demanded. Observe, calculate, execute. The coffin's lid had become a threshold. The battlefield waited beyond it. His first steps would not be for glory, nor for vengeance, nor even for survival. They would be for the Imperium, for the Emperor, for the continuity of war itself. In that realization, the paradox of his existence crystallized, fully aware, fully capable, yet fully subjugated. He braced for the moment when metal would move under thought alone, when the gap between mind and machine would collapse into action. And in that instant, he understood the cruel poetry of the dreadnought's life. To be awake, to be aware, to feel, yet to serve endlessly without choice. Outside, the universe demanded his intervention. Inside, he counted the beats of his borrowed life, preparing for the horrors he would enact in obedience, yet still haunted by the man who had once drawn breath unbound by iron and steel. The moment arrived without ceremony. The sarcophagus, now fully operational, exhaled hydraulics and hissed with life as the first coordinated motions of his limbs executed in perfect synchronization. The man within felt every click, every resistance, every subtle oscillation as both alien and intimate. He was awakening not as himself, but as the fusion of flesh, mind, and machine that the Imperium had demanded. Every joint, every servo, every neural conduit obeyed, and yet the ghost of autonomy lingered, whispering of choices no longer his to make. Outside, the world was chaos incarnate. Bolter fire hammered the distance, orc engines shook the ground with savage rhythm, and the low hum of distant Necron constructs suggested inevitability. He registered it all, mapped every movement, calculated angles and probabilities. The battlefield was a tapestry of data, flowing into him, interpreted by a mind that had once been human, but now operated with a clarity sharpened by centuries of observation and enforced patience. He was no longer a participant in war. He was an instrument through which war manifested. The chaplain's voice, faint but omnipresent, reminded him of duty, of sacrifice, of the unbroken chain of obligation that had transformed him from warrior to relic, from brother to weapon. He did not resist. Resistance had been removed long ago. Obedience was no longer choice, it was existence. Each step he took carried weight beyond physical mass. Each movement was an assertion of the Imperium's will. He had been entombed for centuries to become this, fully aware, fully operational, utterly bound. Yet within that binding lay power. Though autonomy was constrained, the precision and endurance of the dreadnought chassis amplified thought into action. Strategy, perception, and execution merged seamlessly. In the absence of choice, he discovered a form of liberation, one dictated by purpose rather than desire. He was the Emperor's instrument, yes, but also a sentinel, a guardian of history, a witness to the continuity of war. He would endure what no mortal could, act where no living Astartes could, and witness what others could not survive to see. The first engagement approached. Orders filtered through Vox conduits, servo channels, and internal processors. Every calculation, every analysis, every metric was instantly available, yet tempered by the ghost of human thought, memory, instinct, judgment. He moved into position, the metal body responding to commands that were both external and internal. The world beyond the sarcophagus awaited his judgment, yet judgment itself had been surrendered. He would act, and the Imperium would interpret the result. As Chapter 2 closes, the paradox is complete. He is awake. He is aware. He is powerful beyond any living warrior's measure. And yet he is not free. The first battle has not begun, yet the life of a dreadnought is already defined. Eternal vigilance, infinite patience, and the ceaseless execution of the will of an empire that brooks no weakness. The battlefield looms. He braces. The machine and mind are ready. The war calls. The battlefield was not visible, yet it was present in every sensor, every vibration, every hum of the servo-controlled skeleton that now carried his consciousness. The war had moved while he remained entombed, yet he understood it as if it had unfolded before his eyes. Orc warbands tore through manufactorums, Skitarii patrols engaged with enemy incursions, and somewhere beyond the void of planetary atmosphere, void ships unleashed their own silent bombardments. All of it registered not as stories, but as metrics, angles, distances, power fluctuations, and probabilities. He could feel the war not as a man, but as a node in a living network of conflict. He had anticipated this moment for centuries, yet anticipation was not preparation. The first surge of activation carried with it 1,000 micro-adjustments, subtle corrections, and the eerie sensation of consciousness aligning with metal. Each joint responded to thought before he could fully frame it. Each servo, each actuator, each neural conduit bridged the chasm between mind and chassis with terrifying fidelity. There was no hesitation. The machine obeyed instinctively, the mind overlaying strategy atop raw mechanical capability. He was not merely alive, he was optimized. And yet, the man persisted, buried beneath layers of machinery and ritual. Memories surfaced unbidden, the final moments of comrades, the screams of civilians, the faces of enemies he had once faced. They were ghosts in the data stream, haunting him with fragments of emotion and experience that the chassis could neither interpret nor erase. The paradox of the dreadnought revealed itself. Every thought sharpened perception, every memory strengthened resolve, yet every lingering trace of humanity was a tether to a past that no longer mattered. The first orders arrived, not as commands, but as impulses through his neural interface. Data from Vox grills, Auspex feeds, and battlefield sensors converged into coherent directives. Engage, protect, observe. The commands carried with them urgency, subtlety, and the inescapable weight of the Imperium's will. He understood them instinctively, translated them into motion before the conscious mind could question. Obedience was no longer a choice, it was the precondition of existence. He moved from the sarcophagus into the open vault, hydraulics articulating with controlled grace. The floor beneath him vibrated under the weight of motion, the sounds of steel against stone amplifying the sense of inevitability. Outside, the Tech Marines and Chaplain watched, guardians of ritual and faith, ensuring that each movement adhered to tradition as well as function. Their presence was both reassurance and indictment. He would serve, and he would do so precisely as intended. Sensors scanned the battlefield, compiling terrain, structures, friend and foe alike into an integrated mental map. He could anticipate flanking maneuvers, calculate trajectories, predict casualties, and determine outcomes with chilling efficiency. Action and observation merged, instinct and calculation intertwined. The dreadnought was not merely present, he was a fulcrum upon which the balance of war could pivot. And yet, he remained acutely aware of the shadows beneath the metal, the lingering humanity that whispered in moments of quiet, reminding him that he had once been a man, now transformed into something both eternal and constrained. He paused briefly, considering the paradox, to wield such power and yet never possess it fully. Each engagement would demand perfection, endurance, and obedience. Every victory would be interpreted as the will of the Emperor, every failure as a metric for correction. There was no glory in personal achievement, there was only function, purpose, and relentless execution. In this understanding lay both solace and terror. He would act, and yet he would never truly live. Then the distant rumble of engines reached him. The war outside had shifted. Orc vehicles tore through barricades, their guttural roars echoing across the terrain, amplified through his sensory systems. Enemy fire began to map itself in predictable arcs, every trace analyzed before impact. The battlefield awaited him, the summoning complete. The man within, buried yet persistent, braced not for fear, but for the inevitable immersion into violence and duty.